And let me start off the presentation by again just asking the question, and you can write it down on a piece of paper, or you can also write it in the chat box. How present on a scale of 1 to 10 are you going to make yourself available for this presentation today? Because we do have a lot of distractions. It is all online. So how present do you want to be on a scale of 1 to 10? Okay. All right, thank you. Sarah, let me introduce you. Thank you so much for making your time available. Sarah is sitting in Washington, hey?
Mm-hmm.
Sarah is a behavioral researcher and she works for Morningstar. And I was very excited when she agreed to take over and run the presentation today. Behavioral finance has been a little pet love of mine for a long time. Trying to understand what drives people to spend the way they do. How do we look after money? Why do we struggle so much with it? And why has money got so much power over us? And these are the sort of things that Sarah spends her time pondering over and studying, and has done a whole lot of research on. And looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us today. She has said that if you want to stop for questions during, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, we'll ask a couple of questions at the end. So, Sarah, over to you.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you to everybody who's joining. I think the best way to work with questions is, I may not see them if you put them in chat. So Jason, would you mind sort of monitoring the chat box just in case someone puts a question in there?
I don't have an issue with that. Yeah, perfect.
That would be great.
I would prefer, I mean, I am having a bit of an issue on the technical side. So if they want to just ask rather.
Sure, yeah.
Rather just unmute your mic and ask a question, if that would be okay.
Yep, that works too. So I'm going to talk today about the psychology of money, which is my favorite topic. And like Jason said, this is what I spend most of my time thinking about. This may be a little bit different from what you would expect of a talk on behavioral finance, because I think a lot of times when we think about behavioral economics or behavioral finance, we think about the buzzwords that we hear in popular media, like nudges and biases. And those things are important and they matter, but really the only thing that biases touch is our investment style. And one of the things that I'll touch on later is how, frankly, so much more of our money management and our money lives are touched by things other than our investment. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things today that might not be what you're expecting, but hopefully they will resonate. So I want to start by telling you a story about someone that you may not have heard of before, or you may have. This is Hetty Green. She was known as the Witch of Wall Street. She got that moniker because of this black dour dress that she wore every single day. And also because she was known as being so greedy that she was responsible for her son's leg being amputated when he was a child. So this is how the story goes. Hetty was very wealthy. When she was a young woman, she inherited $5 million, and this was back in 1850s. And she turned that $5 million in her lifetime into over $100 million. Now, in today's US dollars, this would be in the billions, and she was easily the richest woman alive. But she was known as a complete miser. And the reason, because she never seemed to spend. So for example, when her son injured his leg as a child, she could have taken him to the best doctors in the world, but instead she literally dressed herself up in rags and took him to the free clinics in New York City. So here she is, the richest woman in the world, not willing to pay for health care for her own son. Now, in her defense, she did take her son to the best doctors in the world. She just didn't want to pay them. So she took him to them when they were volunteering at the free clinics. So Hetty was, she was smart. She was miserly, probably to a fault. And she was very good with money. But I tell you her story because she's an example of someone that I think on the books you could look at and say, wow, she really was financially together because she had so much money. But she wouldn't pay for almost anything. She was so miserly with her money that she died having barely spent a dime of it. And the point being that the quality of life that money could have brought her, she rejected. And Hetty, I think, is an example of someone who is out of balance, someone who, in spite of having more money than she probably could spend had she even wanted to, she didn't ever feel like she had enough. There was no number that was going to make her feel like she had enough. And so Hetty, for me, is an example of what I like to call the worried wealthy, the people who are in they have plenty of financial security, but their quality of life is low. And I see someone's in the chat box, so I'm going to take a brief break.
It's me. I got it. I figured it out.
Great. Okay. So, so this leads to the question of what is financial health really? Because I think Hetty's an example of someone who has lots of money but was not financially healthy. And when I talk with financial advisors, I hear lots of stories of people who have plenty of wealth, but they have trouble enjoying their lives. They have trouble sleeping at night. And this led me to really rethink the idea of financial health, because any algorithm is going to tell you that if you have a certain amount of money, you are financially healthy. But that neglects this other dimension of financial health. So last year I did a lot of research on this, and I came up with a definition of financial health that has two dimensions. First is the one that we always think about. This is financial stability, and this is fairly easy to define. This is having enough assets to be able to maintain your quality of life as long as you will live, or perhaps indefinitely. Financial stability, and being able to withstand shocks should they come your way. But the other dimension of financial health is emotional well-being. And this is the ability to enjoy your quality of life, and that the wealth and the assets that you have are supporting you in living the life that you want to be living. And this is the missing piece that I think a lot of our financial assessments don't cover. And I'm going to talk about what drives both of these things today. But in order to really clearly define financial health, we need to think about it on both of these dimensions. So if we've got the financial stability on the vertical dimension here and emotional well-being on our horizontal dimension, then anyone in this range, we will say, has poor financial health, because even if they have very high financial stability, if they're scoring low on emotional well-being, then they're not truly financially healthy. And vice versa. They can be feeling really wonderful. We all probably know people who feel fine while they have no financial stability at all, and that also doesn't qualify as being financially healthy. Then we have moderate financial health, which is in the mid-range on both of these. And good financial health, then, we would define as someone who has both high financial stability, or is well on their way to high financial stability, and high emotional well-being. This is the only group that we're going to classify as being financially healthy. And so I'll define good financial health as adequate assets to maintain your quality of life, the peace of mind that we think would naturally go along with those assets, but doesn't always, and enjoyment of your circumstances. So in other words, your assets are supporting you as you live your best life. That to me is the real definition of financial health. And that, you may notice, doesn't necessarily mean that you're wealthy beyond most people's wildest dreams, because you can have your assets support you while you live your best life. Your best life is how you define it. And it may not involve a ton of assets. It might be a lot of assets, but it's as you define what your best life is. If your finances and your resources are supporting that, then you're in good financial health. So, what drives the dimensions of financial health? Well, first of all, I looked at financial stability, and this is the one that everybody's been researching forever. And what I found, not surprisingly, because a lot of other people have found this too, is that financial stability is really driven by saving more than anything. Saving, investing, and contribution is king. And there's an article that one of my colleagues wrote in Morningstar magazine last year that had this title, Contribution is King. And the takeaway from that article, after doing a lot of analysis on different asset management styles and different ways of putting portfolios together and running lots of different scenarios, what he found, this was Russ Kinnell, what he found was that while investment style matters and having a solid investment plan matters, what matters more to really getting to your goals financially is whether or not you're contributing at the right amount. And so if you're not putting in to that investment account at the levels that you should be, there's no amount of tweaking that portfolio that's going to make up for the fact that you're not contributing as much as you should. So really the core, the foundation of financial stability is putting money aside and investing it. I think most people understand that. But what can we find psychologically that drives this behavior? And this is where the root of my work really is, because I think that a lot of work in this area focuses on things, especially when we start talking about personality or psychology in money management. A lot of people start talking about personality types and different traits and attributes of people and which personality types are better savers. And that might be interesting, but to me, it doesn't matter. And the reason is because you can't change your personality. And so if you know that a certain personality type tends to save more, how does that help you? It doesn't. The thing that can really help us is if we can understand the changeable factors of mindset, things that if we're not really on par with where we should be, we can change it. You can't change your personality, but you can change other things going on in your mind. So what I do is I search for those changeable factors of mindset that have been shown to have a strong relationship with money management and with well-being, and I focus on those. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 things today that I've found in my research that really drive financial well-being. And there's 2 things that are fairly closely related to one another that seem to be at the root of savings behavior and investing contributions. And that is, the biggest one is how far ahead you think in time. So I did a couple of research studies. This is the results of one. And I asked people how far ahead they tend to think and plan when they think about their money. And this is all in US dollars. But the people who said they think less than a year had on average about 21,000 saved for retirement. And you can see that as that time frame went up, the amount of money they had saved went up. And you may ask, well, is this correlated to age? Because we do tend to think further ahead as we get older. And then that might also explain why there's so much saved. If people who are thinking ahead are also older, then they've had more time to save. And yes, this does correlate to age. But it also correlates to income. You might also have wondered about that. But even when I control for age, education, financial literacy, income, gender, all of these things, I control for all of these things, and this relationship is still significant. And in fact, I'll show you another graph in a moment. But what I want to point out here is that you can see there's almost a linear relationship, that people who think 10 to 20 years ahead had about 10 times as much saved on average as the people who think 1 year ahead. And the people who said, look, I've got a full plan, I've planned it all out, they had on average 20 times as many assets as the people who think less than a year ahead. I mean, this was a very strong correlation here. But of course, income matters. So let's take a look at that. So I know that this is some tiny font, and I'm going to walk you through this graph. This is retirement savings by income and time horizon. So what we have on the vertical axis is the average assets saved for retirement, and it goes from 0 to 500,000. And note, 500,000 is still not nearly adequate for retirement for most U.S. households, but it's much better than the average U.S. household, which is atrocious. Along the vertical, the horizontal line, what we have are income groups, and they go up by 25,000. So the first one is people earning less than 25,000 a year, which is pretty much down at the poverty line in the U.S. And then 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and so on, up to 150K plus, which is in the top, I think that's the top like 5% of US households are earning 150K plus. So what you see is that with both of these lines, there is a general trend upward, that as people earn more, they are saving more. But the orange line represents people who think 10 or more years ahead, and the blue line was people who reported thinking less than 10 years ahead. And you can see that in every single income group, the people who were thinking further ahead were saving consistently more, or they had consistently more saved. And you can also see that for the people who are thinking less than 10 years ahead, they had to be well into earning six figures before they really broke the savings barrier at all. So this is a really fascinating graph to me, because what this shows is the power of thinking further ahead, that and how it gets magnified as your income goes up. And again, this result was significant, and I've done this study repeatedly, so this is a repeated finding. The results are consistent. People who think further ahead are more prepared for their future, and it makes sense, right? When you think about it, of course, if you're thinking further ahead, you're going to plan for that future life that you picture. The second thing that really drives financial stability and savings and investment behavior is really closely related to thinking ahead, and that is having clarity in your mental picture. And I think it's really important to say that this effect, or the effect of this factor, is almost equal to the effect of thinking farther ahead. So if you do both, if you think further ahead and you have a really clear picture of where you want to go, you are putting yourself in a really good position to be internally motivated to save. Because what happens when you have a picture of your future and that picture is clear, it works by making the future feel more real. That then in its turn increases your internal motivation to get there, because you love this dream you're working toward. And it makes goal setting more effective. So if you are one of Jason's clients, then you're able to sit down with him and say, this is where I want to go. And the more clarity and detail you can give to that picture, the more accurate a number he can put onto how much it's going to cost you to live that life you want to be living. And then he can help you plan more effectively to get there. And I know all of us have experienced that you make your plans and then life happens and your plans get shot. And that's fine, because having a plan and knowing the direction you want to go in, and then being able to change course as your life brings the unexpected to you, that's fine. But not having a plan at all because you know that life is unpredictable is what really brings people to ruin, because they can't see far enough ahead to plan. So when it comes to saving, it may seem really simple, but these are the two things that had more when I looked at the effect sizes, because there's a strength of a correlation, that's one thing, but the effect size is the other. And I looked at the effect size of clarity and mental time horizon, and compared the effect size of those factors to the effect size of income and age and education and all of the things that we normally think of when we think of someone who's going to be financially secure. And what I found was that the effect of these two factors was easily double the magnitude of the effect of income and education and age combined. And so, yes, those things matter. Income matters, education matters, age matters, but these things matter more. And so the great news about that is that we can't always change our income. We definitely can't change our age. We can't always go back and change our education level, but we can change how far we're thinking into the future and how clearly we're seeing that picture. So this gives me a lot of hope for people, because it is so simple, and it's something that we can all do to try to make ourselves a little bit more financially stable. Someone like me, I am a very present biased person. Most of us are, but I'm extremely present biased. And so training myself to think this way has made a huge difference in my own internal motivation. So I do know that these tricks work if you use them. So I want to stop for a moment, and before I move on to the second dimension of financial well-being, I want to see if there are any questions at this point.
I have muted everybody, so if they've got a question, please just unmute yourself. Let's see if there's any questions that you'd like to ask.
No? Okay.
I think we're all a little bit scared, Sarah.
All right. Well, no reason to be scared. So, okay, so now we're going to move on to what I think is the juicy stuff, and that is emotional well-being with respect to money. And this is the thing that I think gets so little attention in this field. And the reason I think it gets so little attention is that I think we have this bias as humans that when numbers are involved, emotions aren't supposed to be involved. I really disagree, especially with money, because money touches every area of our lives. Our financial decisions are not just financial decisions. They're decisions that they affect our hopes and our dreams, our relationships. Our financial events are life events. And I think that it's unrealistic to try to say that money should be an unemotional thing in our lives. I do think it's important for us to take note and make sure that money is an emotionally positive thing in our lives. And that's where I think we can struggle. So let's talk about what drives emotional well-being with respect to money. So again, I just want to say I'm defining emotional well-being as having peace of mind, enjoyment of your circumstances. And what I found is that the biggest factor in predicting whether someone is going to feel good about their financial circumstances is not their income, it is not their education, it is not their age, it is whether or not they believe they have power and control in their own financial life. And there's a lot of research that led me to test this factor that hinted that it might be a big player here, and it turns out that it really is. So I want to talk you through another study that I did. And this was, I asked people to which of the following two statements they most agreed with. Either I control my financial destiny, or I have very little power over my financial future. And I want to be clear that even the people who said they had very little power over their financial future were oftentimes very high earners, and they were the breadwinners. So these aren't just people who actually don't have control over the earning or spending in their households. These are people who feel that their financial future is determined more by external factors than by internal ones. And I think that in a country like South Africa, this may actually be something that that some of you experience, at least on a semi-regular basis, because the economy is somewhat turbulent. I was there 2 years ago. I landed in South Africa the day that the finance minister was arrested for fraud. So that was an interesting moment. And because there's been so much growth and so much very fast growth in Africa over the last few decades, and there's this question of when is it going to stable off, or has it peaked, has it not? I think that your markets and your economies have more turbulence than the U.S. market, or maybe some more fully developed and sophisticated markets. And so there may be more of a tendency to feel that these external factors that you can't control do have power over what's going to happen to your finances. And so I think that this is something to pay close attention to, because there are things in our lives that we can't control. Like the financial markets. And there are things in our lives that we can control, like how much we are contributing and how we are responding to the situations as they come up, and how much of a plan we have, how much of a contingency plan we have, how much we diversify, things like that. So I asked people these two questions, or to choose one of these two. I control my financial destiny versus this is really out of my hands. And then I asked them, this is where things get a little bit complex. I asked them, how often do you experience the following emotions with respect to your money? And I asked them about 4 positive emotions and 4 negative emotions. And so for each one of these, they marked on a scale from almost never to almost always. So they got a score for all the positive emotions and a score for all the negative emotions. And then I subtracted the negative from the positive to get a net emotional score. So if someone got a score of 0, that means that they had an equal amount of positive as negative, and overall it was a wash. If they have a positive score, that means that they were experiencing more positive emotions with respect to their money than they were experiencing negative emotions, and vice versa. Someone with a negative score may have been feeling some positive emotions, but their negative emotions outweighed them. So that scale is what the next graph you're going to see is based on. So when you look at this graph, that 0, that right in the middle of the graph where the colors separate, that is the neutral line. That's where positive and negative separate. So anything above that line is people who were feeling mostly positive, and anything below that middle line is people who were feeling mostly negative. And the green bars represent the people who said, I create my financial destiny, and the orange bars represent people who said, I have very little power over my financial future. And you can see a very, very clear trend here that yes, as income goes up, because again, on the horizontal axis, we have the same income groups. And as income goes up, yes, the lines tend to go up. You can see the trend lines there. It does trend that the more money you have, the more positive your emotional experiences with money tend to be, lower stress, lower anxiety, things like that. But very clearly, everyone, including people who were earning $25,000 or less, which again is basically the poverty line in the US, even people who were struggling financially were having mostly positive experiences with their money if they believe that they have power in their financial life. But the people who believe that they don't have power, again, they had to be well into 6 figures before they even broke through and felt positive, more positive than negative emotions. And so again, I looked at the effect size, and again, the effect of this factor was greater than the effect of income. It's greater than the effect of age. It's greater than the effect of education. And so this factor of whether or not you feel powerful in your own financial life has a huge effect. And I want to tie this back to Hetty Green for a minute, because Hetty represents to me Now, obviously, she died a long time ago. I can't talk to her about this, but her behavior to never have enough, there was never a number that made her feel like, okay, now I can afford to pay a doctor. Or another famous story about her, she went on a bus to meet J.P. Morgan one day with $200,000 in bonds in her purse. And these were like bond certificates. They could have been stolen from her at any moment. And he said, why didn't you just take a cab? And she said, you might be able to afford a cab, but I can't. So here's a woman, the richest woman in the world, doesn't consider herself having enough money to afford taking a coach, and takes the bus instead. So there was something going on in her mind that made it so that she never felt secure. And this factor right here, the amount of power that you feel like you have in your financial life, is really tied to that feeling of security. Because if you believe that things outside yourself are more responsible for your financial future than you are, and the things that you can control, then you're obviously going to be filled with dread, especially if you think that those factors may play against you. And so this feeling of not being in control can lead to fear and hanging on, and no matter how much you have, it's never enough, because you're constantly going to be thinking, what if, what if, what if? And those what ifs will haunt you, and you won't be able to sleep at night no matter how much money you have. So this is the underlying factor, I believe, with the worried wealthy, is this feeling that things might happen to me that I can't control and I can't stand up against. And so this here, I think, has a huge effect on our emotional well-being, which would explain why it had such an effect in my study. Okay, there's one other thing. And actually, I want to stop there for a moment and see, because when I talk about that, a lot of people know someone, they'll say, oh, that's my dad, or that's my uncle, or that's me. Someone who never seems to have enough, never feels okay, regardless of how much money they have. And so I want to stop here before I move on, because I know I'm dumping a lot of stats and things on you. So again, chance to ask a question, make a comment, share a story, anything.
Okay, I've got a question around that. When people are feeling like victims around their money, they can't do anything about it, how often have they actually taken control to see if they can do something about it and then feel more empowered, or do they just give up?
Well, it really depends. And I think it's a good question, especially if there's someone in your life that you know that struggles with this, and you want to help them, whether it's yourself or someone else that you want to help. There is actually, in psychology, there's this phenomenon known as learned helplessness. And it's a very powerful malfunction in our psyches. Malfunction may be too strong a word, but what happens is that if at any point in your life you have actually been without power, then you've learned that even when you try, you can't get ahead. And there are lots of people. I think it's also really important for us to recognize that there are lots of people in our world that try really hard and work with all their might, but because of systemic issues, because of societal issues that we need to solve together, they can't get ahead. And so there are, what I'm not saying here, I don't want to get into victim blaming and saying, oh, people who are struggling just need to pull themselves up, because a lot of them are trying or have tried and they can't. And learned helplessness is when your real situations in your life have taught you for real that you don't have power. And so people who are in that kind of situation, they're sometimes, they can't get ahead for trying. Other people are now no longer in that situation. And here's what happened when scientists studied learned helplessness back in the 70s with dogs. They put one group of dogs in these electrified cages where the floor had this shock that would, it would shock their paws from underneath. And there was a button or a lever, something that the dogs could manipulate that would turn the shock off. And one group of dogs was in a cage where if they pushed the button, the shock would turn off and they would be fine. A second group of dogs was in cages where if they pushed the button, nothing happened, and they still would get the shock, and they learned that they didn't have control over their environment, over their situation. So they put these two groups of dogs in these situations. One learned they had power, the other group learned they did not have power. And then they took them all out, mixed them up again. Then they put all the dogs into a cage that had the button that they could turn everything off. And the ones that had learned that they had control over their environment, they pushed the button, they got out of the cage, everything was fine. The ones that had learned previously that they couldn't control their environment didn't even try to push the button, and they just laid down and whimpered. And what was really fascinating, I mean, yes, this was a cruel subject, or it was a cruel way to deal with them, but what they learned was that the people running the test, they had to literally go in and move the dog's legs, like show them physically that they did have control. And they didn't have to do it once, they had to do it several times in order for the dogs to relearn. So once the dogs had learned that they didn't have power, that belief was so strong that they had to, it took a lot of effort to overwrite that belief for them to learn that maybe they didn't have power in the past, but they do have power now. And that happens with humans too. If at any point in your life you have not had power, you have not had control, then even when your situation changes, sometimes you can still believe that you don't have power. So people who come into money, for example, through an inheritance or business success or something where business success is less prone to learned helplessness because that involves personal effort. And so it is often the teacher that you do have power. But someone who comes into money when they didn't go out and earn it, they can often struggle with learned helplessness because they haven't had the evidence to show them that they actually have power now. And so the reason I tell you that story is first of all to understand that this is not a failing of human nature. This is something that our brains do for, I think, good reason. But we have to understand what our limitations are and how hard we have to work to overwrite beliefs that we've already come to identify with. And so if there's someone in your life that doesn't feel powerful, even though maybe they do have power now, be patient, because it took the dogs several times to relearn, and it takes humans a lot of time to relearn as well once we're in a new situation. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, definitely, thank you. I think they did that study with elephants as well. Similar study where they did the elephants. Anyway.
Yeah, well, and with elephants too. I mean, with both dogs and elephants, we know that they're very, these are sentient creatures. They think similarly to us in many ways, and they have emotional lives like we do. Yeah. And so I think that those can be really, really relevant to think about. So the point being that if you struggle with learned helplessness, then looking for ways that you do have power, really focusing on the areas where you do have power in your life really matters. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last of the 4 things that affect our financial well-being, and then I'm going to walk us all through something so that hopefully all of you that have joined today can walk away just a little bit financially healthier than you started. So,
thank you.
Okay. So the last of the 4 elements that I've found in my research that really affect financial well-being, and this affects our emotions more than our saving, although this one also does, there's some crossover, is social comparisons. So I did a big study earlier this year on the effect of social comparisons on financial well-being. And, you know, I mean, it's not surprising, I think, to any of us. We live in an Instagram culture, and we're constantly comparing our lives with everybody else's highlight reel. And there's lots of research and news articles and things out there about how social media can really lead to depression and a lot of feelings of worthlessness, because we do make these unrealistic comparisons to people's airbrushed and highlighted versions of their lives. But I wanted to know specifically if financial comparisons were serving us or not serving us, and how prevalent they are. So I did a study where I asked people, when you compare yourself to others financially, first of all, do they tend to be better off or worse off than yourself? And shocker, everybody, and not everybody, but more than half of everybody in every single income group tends to compare to those who they think are better off. And at first I thought, well, maybe what we're trying to do is motivate ourselves. We're trying to say, oh, well, I'm looking at them because I want to be like them. So then the question comes, well, how does it serve us? Is it helping us? Is it motivating us? Is it making us feel better? But so I asked, are they better off or worse off than you? How often do you find yourself comparing yourself to other people financially? And then who are they? Are they your family? Are they friends or colleagues, your neighbors? Are they celebrities? Yourself at a prior time in life, or a mentor or role model? Who are you comparing yourself to? And in looking at all these things, and then again, I did the same emotional scoring that I did with the locus of control study. This is again along the horizontal axis. Those are the income groups. It's not there in the graph. I apologize for that. But again, we have the neutral line right here, and the positive emotions here, negative emotions here. And this red line represents the people in each income group that were, when they made financial comparisons, they were looking at people who they believed were worse off than them, less fortunate than them. And the blue line is people who were looking at those, making upward comparisons, looking at people who they thought were better off. And again, just like with saving, just like with feelings of power, the people who were making downward comparisons, who were comparing themselves with people who they felt were less fortunate, were significantly happier in every single income group than the people who were comparing with those who feel better off. Really not all that surprising when you think about it, but sometimes it's good to see the numbers and to see this is actually a thing. So here's where this gets interesting and where it gets to be something we can work with. And I'm going to back up for a second because that next graph is somewhat complex, and so I want to make a point before I talk about it. I found that looking at people who we think are better off, seems to have a very negative effect on our emotions. And that in every single income group, whether if you were looking up or if you were feeling bad, if you were looking at those who were worse off, you tended to feel pretty good. And that's not that surprising. But then when I looked at this same effect based on who that target was, I saw something really interesting. And what's important here is that the solution to this, before I show you the next graph, the solution to social comparisons is not to stop comparing. It's not. And we may be told that from infancy, just don't compare yourself to other people. But the reality is that when you study psychology, you come to understand that we can't stop comparing ourselves to other people. It's an innate drive in the human psyche that we want to know how we measure up. We want to know how we're doing at this life thing And if we don't have an objective standard by which to judge ourselves, then what we do is we choose someone to judge ourselves by. And we will see if we measure up to them. And so this is what we're doing when we compare ourselves to our neighbors or our families or our colleagues or whoever. It's this natural need to figure out, do I measure up? Am I doing this right? And what I saw through doing this study is that this natural drive to figure out how we're doing is driving us into feeling terrible. So something is wrong with the way that we're doing it. So this is where the next graph becomes interesting, because if we can't stop ourselves from comparing, then we could do one of two things. This graph here says, it basically suggests that, well, why not look, instead of looking at people who are better off, why not look to people who are worse off so that you can feel better about where you're at? And I think that that's probably good advice. And it's actually advice that's been around since forever. We're always told to look at those who are less fortunate, to be grateful for what we have. And there's plenty of research on the power of gratitude in improving your well-being. But the reason why I am not stopping with that advice is that that advice has been around for a long time. And yet most people are still comparing with those who are better off. And so we're not taking that advice. So if that advice is not working, then we also need other advice. So this is where the next bit of research I think is really helpful. So the way to read this graph, this first bar with the big red arrow pointing at it is pointing at the few people in my study who compared themselves with a mentor or a role model, and they bucked the trend. They felt good about their own financial situation, whether that person was doing better off or worse off than them. And yes, you can have someone as a financial role model if they make less than you, because maybe you admire their contentment. Maybe you admire their behavior. It doesn't have to be someone wealthier than you in order to be a role model. Anyway, everybody else, you can see the people who are comparing themselves to themselves at a previous time of life, their friends and colleagues, which was by far the biggest group. That's where most of us make comparisons. Our family members, our neighbors, the celebrities, there was just a tiny little group. It wasn't even worth putting in. But in every other group, looking at those who were worse off made people feel better, and looking at those who were better off made them feel bad. But with the role model group, they felt good, and significantly good, regardless of what direction they were looking when they looked at that role model. And so I did a follow-up study, because this first group was too small for me to really draw real conclusions from. So I did a follow-up study where I did an experiment, and I asked people to do a very simple thought exercise with choosing a role model and asking a couple of questions about them. And I did that with one group of people. A second group of people, I just asked them questions about who they normally compare themselves with. And then the third group of people didn't do any kind of activity. And then all three answered the same emotional questions and about money. And what I found was that the people who did this 2 to 3 minute exercise significantly reported higher levels of confidence with respect to their financial goals, and stronger feelings of control. So back to the locus of control, back to the learned helplessness. Doing this role model exercise can help someone who doesn't feel in control to feel more in control. So we have a couple of things here from all of these studies over the last 2 years that I've done. I found that more than the regular suspects, more than income, more than education, more than age, financial stability is driven by how far ahead you're thinking and how clear and detailed your picture of the future is. And emotional well-being with respect to your money is driven by that belief that you shape your financial future, and focusing your need to compare on a positive financial role model. So with that in mind, let's get you all just a little bit healthier right now. So I want to take a moment, and if you're still paying attention, just give me a thumbs up or a yes in the chat box. Nice, great.
Where's the chat box?
Nice, somebody found the thumbs up. Very nice, very nice. Okay, great. So just a little attention check there. Okay, so now if you have a piece of paper or something handy, grab it now. What we're going to do is just take a couple of minutes before we open it up for questions, and I'm going to walk you through the exact thing that I did with this second group. This is a thought exercise, so this is for you. No one is going to see this, but if research can be believed, then taking the next 2 minutes and doing this sincerely might really have a great impact for you. So I want you to just think about someone you admire financially, and please make sure that their success is realistically attainable for you. Otherwise, this can backfire. And there's research that if you have a role model who is actually someone who you deep down don't believe you can be like, then it can backfire. It can be demoralizing. So please don't choose Warren Buffett. We all love Warren. He's wonderful, and he's humble, and he's great. But please choose someone who you believe you really can be like financially if you were to make that decision. And all you need to do is write their first name down on a piece of paper. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds, whoever comes to mind, and it doesn't have to be someone that you know deeply. You don't even really need to know all the facts about their financial life. As long as your perception of their financial life and their financial behavior is positive, that works. So choose someone and write down their first name. Okay. Now, what is it about their financial life or their behavior that you admire? Just pick one thing, maybe two. What is it about them that made you choose them? And write that down. Okay, now we get into the good stuff. What are the qualities or the attitudes that they have that you think lead them to behave in that way? So what is it internally about them that's driving them to this behavior that you admire? And again, you don't have to know specifically, you can take a guess. And lastly, do you have any of those qualities that you just named? Generally, when people admire something in someone else, this is an interesting thing to see. When we admire someone in someone else, often we have those very same qualities. It's one of the things that draw us to other people, is that we see ourselves in them, even if we don't quite realize it. So chances are that you probably have, in some shape or form, one of the qualities that you admire in them that are leading them to their good financial behavior. So if you have one of those qualities, or any quality that you think they have that are helping them financially that you also have, write that down. And write it in the form of I am blank, or I value blank. Okay, so now that you have someone to emulate, someone to take that natural need to compare and channel it in a positive direction, now we're going to do a quick little exercise focused on the other side of financial well-being, which is our clarity and of time horizon. And so here what we're going to do is set a goal. And Jason, I'm hoping you will be able to follow up a little bit with this, with people's goals, so that if you're doing this with me today, that then you will take your goal and talk to Jason about it so that he can help hold you accountable.
So I'm accountable. Great.
So now that you have a role model, it's time to set a goal. And remember, the time horizon here is really important, but we all have a different mental time horizon. So if you tend to only think about a year ahead, then just don't try to think 40 years ahead, just think 2. If you plan for 10 years already, then try to push that out a little more. And if you're somebody who can't see next week, then just really try to think about, okay, October, what is October gonna be like for me? Okay, so get your head in that time frame that's just a little bit further than you tend to normally think, and set one SMART goal. And a SMART goal is something that is specific, it is measurable, it's attainable, it's relevant, and in this case, relevant needs to be, this is something that you can do that will make you just a little bit more like your financial role model. And time dependent, so put yourself in that future moment. And so if you can pick one thing, so for example, my role model that I just identified is my sister, Amy. She is not materialistic, she is resourceful, she saves regularly, and I think that that's based on qualities where she's humble and she values stability over flash. And I value strength, which is very, I think, similar to stability. And I also really like flash, but I can get very much behind stability. And I also am growing, I think, in my humility. So I can, in my SMART goal, is that I want to, by this time next year, I want to have saved 5% more in my retirement savings than I do now every month. So that's a specific, measurable, attainable, and relevant goal.
Can I hold you accountable?
You sure can. All right. And so I think that puts us right up on our time, but I can see a few more moments if people have questions. And I hope that this has given you some insight into yourself or the other people in your life and helped you think about financial well-being a little bit differently, but hopefully in a way that's relevant and real to your life. So I'm just going to open it up. If anybody has questions, I'm watching the chat box now.
Okay. Sarah, thank you so much for your time. It really was fantastic. I'll also just hang back a couple minutes and see if there are questions. You're more than welcome to join us for the next talk, if I can just add in 2 minutes here, that I want to have on the, I'll just tell you now, the 24th of October. And I think what you'll enjoy about that talk is the guy that I've got to speak, he grew up in the townships. And he was a guy who, at face value, had no opportunities, but is now running a £1 billion company. He's empowered himself, and I'll send out the invites for that. But if you feel like getting up at 3 in the morning, you're more than welcome to join us, and I'll send you the invites. Anyway, so thank you.
Thank you,
If
Jason.
you want to answer the questions, I don't know if there are any coming up.
Hi, Jace. Hannes here.
Hi.
Just
How's that, Hannes?
yeah, good man. Sarah, just a quick question coming from a young guy. I work also in the insurance industry, and I've realized, and I don't know if you found a correlation between the increase in income and living expense. I think that's a pretty common thing that happens, right?
Oh yeah, we say that that expenses rise to meet income, and yeah, it's a really it's a terrible trap actually. And one of the reasons is because once you increase your income, what do we tend to do? But we move into a new neighborhood. We move into a place where we have different neighbors, and maybe we do it because we want our children to go to a better school, or because we're trying to upgrade our own quality of life. But then what happens is that we immediately start comparing ourselves to a different group of people. And then those people are spending more money. And all of a sudden, we feel this need to have things that we didn't feel like we needed to have before. And it's very, very human. I actually have a blog I wrote after I visited South Africa called South Africa Wears Prada. And I can send Jason the link to send you guys. But South Africa is actually the largest consumer of luxury goods in the entire continent of Africa. And it's really interesting to see what's happening, because when people move income classes, when we go up the economic ladder, what happens is then we have a different tribe that we're trying to belong with. And one of the ways that we send signals of belonging is by having the same things that people around us do. So whether it's the same type of home, or the same type of appliances, or cars, or clothes, or whatever it is, we use these material things to signal to one another that we belong. And it can become incredibly expensive all of a sudden. Once you move to a different neighborhood, now you need all different things in order to fit in. And so it's a huge trend. It's also something that traps a lot of people. So you end up earning more than you ever thought you would, and still feeling poor because you're spending more than you ever did.
Yeah. So, but the actual question I want to get to is, so you're saving throughout your life, and eventually you'll probably hit some of your goals. But like with this progression, obviously you're getting new goals. As you said earlier, your picture does change, I think, perhaps a few times during the course of your life. But how much saving is enough? Is there a fixed formula? Do you when is enough, right?
A good rule of thumb, and the thing is, it depends on so many things, right? It depends on how long you have to save up. It depends on how you're investing. A good rule of thumb is about 20%, but that's based, first of all, on the U.S. economy, and it's more or less, if you want to take, I think a good calculation is, you say, think about how much, if you stopped working, the lifestyle you want to live, how much would that cost you today to live that lifestyle? So how much per year? And then you need to figure out, with inflation, how much that's going to cost you in the future. And generally, so in the US, generally we would say you need about 20 times that amount. So if you wanted to live a lifestyle that cost you $50,000 a year, and I'm sorry, I just don't have RAND numbers to be able to throw out. But in the US, if you wanted to live a lifestyle that cost you $50,000 a year, then you would need about 2 million in assets to support that fairly indefinitely. So you take the income you want, multiply it by that number, and then that gives you the number you need in order to stop working. And then you can work backwards of, well, how much do I need to save and invest in order to get there?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other question?
Okay.
Right. Otherwise, Sarah, I mean, if
By email if people are shy.
to come up that, yeah, I can send you through questions, and if anything comes up, but yeah.
Okay.
Okay, no one else is asking anything. So thank you very much. I really do. And yeah, all of you have a fantastic day ahead. And Sarah, you have the longest day ahead. Enjoy.
All right.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.